but the greatest majority of the images are from, as you know, the Persian and Turkic world. There are many, and that's one of the questions I get a lot. Why are there no images in an Arab cultural ambit, right? There are, of course, many answers one could give, but for Iran or Persian culture, there's a very long history. So Muhammad is here endowed with these external attributes or metaphors that make him recognizable as a prophet, even though he's not a prophet when he's in his youth, but it's recognizable. And all of the humans and even the camels kind of create this orbit, this circumrotational movement
I was about
around.
to mention that.
But now I'm thinking about it, is that we have a lot of these depictions in the 1300s and 1400s, and we're looking at a Mongol Turkic period right here, right? Where the prime is placed on the testing of the cups. And as you mentioned, the Mongols had cup rituals, including the drinking of the blood of horses. And then that adds a whole other dimension, right? We talked about rubbing images or adding veils to Muhammad's face, but in this case, somebody came along, didn't want an image of the Prophet Muhammad, most likely a Muslim owner or artist. And the strategy there was not adding a veil or removing the figure, but adding a calligraphy on top. And so,
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another installment of the Real Talk podcast. As many of you already know, because I say it in the beginning of every and each episode, I'm your host, Tehran, and as always, I'm joined by my brilliant co-host, Roxana. This episode is going to be a real treat for y'all, as I'd like to believe all our episodes are. But this one, in all honesty, is of particular interest as it taps into something that is a bit controversial. But under closer inspection, it doesn't really have to be, in my opinion. And that's the topic of pictorial representations of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Islamic art. To help guide us through this complex topic, which involves much more than what meets the eye, we have the honor of welcoming the esteemed art historian, Professor Christiane Gruber. Thank you, Professor Gruber, for joining us for this discussion on such a rich topic.
thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. And Professor Gruber, you've authored and edited numerous influential works on Islamic art and visual culture, one of them being the Ilkhanid Book of Ascension, which is a Persian Sunni devotional tale about a Persian Sunni devotional tale. You also have the Image Debate, which is about figural representation in Islam and across the world. And of course, the Praiseworthy One, as many of you might see in the back, the Prophet Muhammad in Islamic Texts and Images, which we'll be drawing from in today's conversation. So, since Islamic art history is a relatively new subject for us, and you're a new guest on here, though I certainly hope that we explore more episodes on Islamic art in the future and maybe have you on depending on how this one goes. I'd love to begin by giving our audience a chance to get to know you a bit better. For those who might not be familiar with your scholarship, could you tell us about what initially sparked your interest in Islamic art history or art history more broadly, and what kinds of questions or themes have guided your work over the years?
Thanks so much, Taryn. I've always been interested in the visual. I'm a visual person. So growing up, a little bit all over the world, I went to museums and looked at artworks. I was first trained as a Europeanist, Italian painting in particular. But then when I became a junior in high school, I got this really wonderful fellowship from the U.S. Council on U.S.-American Relations to go spend an entire summer in the Middle East. So as a 16-year-old, I started learning Arabic and the history of the Arab world, and that really stayed with me. And so when I went to college, I decided to keep doing Arabic. And in my sophomore year, the art history department hired its very first Islamic art historian. And then things started to really click for me at that point, and I shifted over from European art to Islamic art. Keep in mind, that was the mid 1990s. This was way before 9/11, the Yulun's Poston Mohammed cartoon controversy in 2005. I once was asked what I was studying, and I said Islamic art, and the person said, I love Eskimo art. So they were confusing Islamic with Inuit. That Islam was not on the radar as it is today. And so I really thought I was going into a very niche, and it's still very much a small field, although for various reasons over the last 3 decades, Islam and Islamic art have really emerged in the public eye. for better or worse. So here we are today talking about a subject that I really thought would be in my office and behind a glass door, so to speak.
All right. And Professor Gruber, before we get into the images themselves, I want to ask what motivated you to write The Praiseworthy One, a book that brings together both pictorial and textual representations of the Prophet Muhammad in Islamic art. It's a bold project, especially given how controversial and contested this subject can be, both within and outside the Muslim community. So, what drew you to it, and what did you hope to offer or perhaps even challenge with this book?
So the way I got to the subject was that I was writing my PhD dissertation on texts and images of the Prophet Muhammad's ascension, which is known as Miraj or Kitab al-Miraj or Miraj Name, depending on the Islamic language. And that was because I was conjoining art history with Islamic studies, and those were always my two fields. And I was very interested in reading all of the texts in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish about the Prophet's ascension and really understand theologically what that meant. So I was interested in the biography of the Prophet, apocalyptics, of course, because ascension tales are about heaven and hell, and then how those were relayed both pictorially and textually. And I remember very clearly that one of my committee members said, "You're not discussing in your dissertation the fact that these images of the prophet are changing over time,"
Hmm.
because I was really focused on the ascension. And that person said, "You really need to explain why we see these different depictions of the prophet over centuries and they change." And that stayed with me. And I thought, oh, I need to figure out that challenge for myself. And then I wrote a pilot article that then was published, the first article really on the development of the images of the prophet. That article came out right around 2005, which happens to be when the Yulin's post and cartoon controversy burst in the open. And I had to think to myself, is this a topic that I wish to continue pursuing, or am I facing a situation where I'm going to have to put to rest my own expertise? And I think a lot of us as academics have to face a decision at some point or another, whether we stay where we are or bid farewell to a particular field of interest. And I decided I really wanted to continue. This was my vocation and my calling, regardless of what was happening in the world. And so that's when I developed my pilot piece into the book that you see there. It took about a decade, right? It came out in 2019. So it brewed for about 10 to 14 years, I would say. And I had to go all around the world, find as many images as I could. And what I tried to offer, as you asked, is a really fleshed out, complex, nuanced, rich story about this corpus of material that can't really be pigeonholed in one way or another. And the challenge for me was to always follow the data, regardless of where it took me. I really couldn't come to the topic with a preconceived notion, which meant really shifting the chapters. One chapter got jettisoned because it just didn't pan out, finding those motifs. And in the end, of course, there's that challenge to a monolithic, static narrative about a thing that has always been. Of course, we're historians, we know that's not the case. But in the end, I think I'm very similar to other academics. The challenge was a challenge to myself. I had an intellectual query, right? A inquiry, a skepsis, as you put. And I needed to resolve it just for myself. So there was an intellectual puzzle that I really enjoyed. And I enjoyed that decade trying to solve it for myself. And I thought if it can be of interest to others, then all the better.
Sounds wonderful. Definitely has been an interest of myself. So,
You discuss how visual depictions of Muhammad have emanated largely from Persian and Turkish lands from the 13th to the 18th century in your book. Why did these cultures in particular produce the majority of prophetic imagery, and why do we have so few images of the prophet that predate the medieval period?
So the book, as you will have noticed, takes on, yes, a lot of texts that are from the Arab world and are in Arabic. But the greatest majority of the images are from, as you note, the Persian and Turkic world. There are many, and that's one of the questions I get a lot. Why are there no images in an Arab cultural ambit, all right? There are, of course, many answers one could give, but for Iran or Persian culture, there's a very long history of visual depiction, stretching all the way back to the Achaemenid period, going forward through the Sasanian period. So there's a long history of figural depiction, including in the public sphere in Iran from 2000 BC all the way up to the Muslim invasions or conquests. So that stratum keeps going, but in a changed form. The same holds true for Turkic cultures. So if you were to look, for example, at Anatolia, in particular, of course, we've got the Seljuks, who are the Muslim inheritors of Byzantine realms, and there's a very long tradition, of course, of figural imagery within Christian traditions. And there are many interactions in medieval Anatolia between Christian communities, whether you're talking about Eastern Orthodox, Armenian, Georgian, etc., with communities who were Muslim. And many artists who were functioning in these book ateliers were not necessarily Muslim. So we know, for example, in the 13th century, that the book atelier of the Ilkhanids had Chinese artists, had Georgian artists, had Central Asian artists, had Armenian artists. And so those artists would also draw upon their traditions and the templates they know. So if you have to represent a scene of a birth, you might draw on a nativity scene. All right, if you have a scene of the Prophet Muhammad rising through the heavens, you might draw on a resurrection scene. So this is also about the knowledge of visual language that gets transferred in some way or another. And your question about why there are so few images that predate the medieval period, one of the reasons could be that in 1258, the Abbasid library in Baghdad, known as Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom, was destroyed during the Mongol invasions. And so it's very sad, but it is a reality that between the rise of Islam in 1258, yes, we do have plenty of manuscripts that exist, but plenty were also destroyed. So it's impossible to know what was lost in the destruction of the Beit al-Hikmah. There are a few images that predate that destruction, but really the story of images of the Prophet begins in the 13th century and then blooms from the 14th century onward.
And what kind of images do we know of that predated this period of the Mongol conquest that destroyed a lot of the artworks? Do we know what kind of pictorial representations they were? Um,
Of the Prophet in particular?
yes, yes.
So I've included, I think, a few in the book in the earliest chapter. They represent the prophet fully figurally, so his face is not covered by facial veil. He doesn't necessarily have a flaming halo either, but there are a few motifs around him that suggest that he's more than a man. You know, whether he's accompanied by angels, or there's a light shining on him, or he's surrounded by flowers, and we can talk about those motifs a little bit more later. And sometimes he's also surrounded by the Rashidun. So it's not just the Prophet, but the Prophet and on his entourage also.
So in your book, you discuss how pictorial art constructed a metaphorical Muhammad, one who transcends historical specificity. What sort of common polyvalent visual symbols can we trace across epics that contribute to the iconographic construction of this metaphorical Muhammad?
Mhm. Yeah, that's my major angle in the book, right? That Muhammad is more than just a historical figure, though of course he is that. There are plenty of studies on the search or the quest for the historical Muhammad. We're familiar, of course, with those books. And of course, there are also studies about how Muhammad was seen in the eyes of his beholders. Yuri Rubin has written about that. And of course, Anne-Marie Schimmel is probably the leading scholar with her book, and Muhammad is his messenger, and thinking really about how Muhammad was already mythified already during his lifetime. Many of us become, the subjects of myths while we're still alive. And the construction of historical personae go through a process of metaphorical thinking. And still today, that happens over and over again with important individuals such as the Prophet Muhammad. And so I was interested to find out metaphorically what Muhammad meant to his communities of believers over time by looking at those metaphors, especially as they're developed in text and in images, because oftentimes they sync up. And the major metaphors that I detected in the visual corpus were several. The first is that the Prophet Muhammad was often conceptualized as more than man. He was, in fact, a mortal human being. He was not like Jesus Christ, a trans substance, right? Or partly a divinity. However, he wasn't just a man. He was more than that. You know, he had the ability to speak with God on the night of his ascension without an intermediary. He was capable of miracles like ascending to the sky or splitting the moon. And so, how does one speak about that? How does one show that he's more than a man? And so you can do that with these external features, as I mentioned before, accompanied by angels, scent or light rays pouring down on him, surrounded by olfactory motifs like flowers that might smell like paradise. Those are all external factors to his physical corpus. At the same time that he's more than man, he's also more than flesh. And so I became interested in those paintings where the flesh yields to something else. So the face yields to a facial veil. And that's not just about prohibition, although there is that aspect, right, of not wishing to show the prophet fully in his physical being, but also the notion of not revealing that which is too beautiful to behold or maybe carries the light of God. And so the facial veil is actually the subject of a lot of poetic thinking about the seen and unseen, the veil that is beyond comprehension and sight. So that's one potential metaphor. Another one is that the prophet, very often in the Islamic textual corpus, is described as a pre-existing light, as a nur. And that's so widespread, it's known as the Nur Muhammad, as you all know. And so I ask myself when I'm looking at these images where he has a flaming halo, or his whole face becomes a bundle of flames, or the whole body becomes a bundle of flames, how is that interacting with the notion of the Nur Muhammad? So the prophet becomes this kind of generative substance of enlightenment and creation into the world, and how are artists coping with that metaphor, which has nothing to do with the physical qualities of the man himself. Other models, of course, and metaphors were that he's the complete and perfect man, right? Al-insan al-kamil, that he's also a beautiful prototype or exemplum, an uswa hasana. So this notion of conveying his beauty was also important, just like conveying his words as his verbal relics, right? The hadith was very important. And then in the end, the metaphor of the image itself, not just the metaphor of Muhammad, but the metaphor of the image of the Prophet Muhammad, kind of becoming more meta about the subject, is what does that do? And I came to think of the images as really telescopes into a mental contemplation to be able to imagine and maybe communicate somehow in your inner eye, in your soul, in your mind with this beautiful example, and that's the Prophet of Islam. So it's the images are not the subject of necessarily devotion, of what we would call idolatry, but they actually help achieve something by channeling devotional thought or feeling.
You've already touched on this slightly when you were discussing the different types of artists who are working on these sort of representations, but how much have Islamic representations of the Prophet drawn on religious iconography from other religious communities? And was this strategic in the sense that was it used as a means of proselytizing to other faiths?
That's a great question. And I think there are two parts of that question, which is where are these motifs coming from and where are they going? So reception and then, of course, propagation. So as I mentioned before, many of the artists are drawing upon their own traditions, whether it's a Central Asian type of Buddhism where you'll represent the angels like apsaras with floating ribbons. That would be just a visual lexicon that could be easily marshaled within an Islamic cultural register. For certain kinds of scenes, as I mentioned before, depicting the birth of the prophet, and we will look at one of those images, an artist could either draw on Christian nativity scenes Or if that artist is in fact a Christian artist in a Muslim atelier, they would perhaps reiterate some of those motifs without necessarily being cognizant of the tropes because we're all enmeshed in our own social and cultural settings at any given point. So the artists can be conscious or unconscious about the tools, the strategies, and the motifs that they use. The other question, which is also another bigger question, is whether then those images, by having those elements baked inside them, so to speak, would then be effective tools for proselytization and conversion. For a few decades, my colleagues have been debating whether images can actually be used to either convert or strengthen the faith. I think images definitely can help strengthen the faith because they can convey certain motifs. Conversion is a different phenomenon because if you're talking about conversion of numbers of individuals, the kinds of paintings that we're talking about and we'll talk about today, which are 14th century royal paintings, they would not have circulated outside of a very restrained group of people. We're talking elite of elite, a king, the princes, probably sons, daughters, maybe the upper crust of the court, and that's about it. So in terms of proselytization, one royal manuscript that would take years to make and it exists in only one copy doesn't have that much of a footprint when you talk about proselytization. However, if you do have, say, one painting that could accompany, let's say hypothetically, a storyteller, and of course, storytellers or qasas have been studied as vectors for conversion of Islam. Khalil Athamina has written a great article on that. It was about 30 years ago on storytellers as preachers and converters to the faith. And there are paintings of the Prophet that are pretty large scale, and they might have been used to point to certain details while stories were being relayed. And in those cases, they could be used to help convert in a storytelling environment. So we would have to be really sort of careful about how we decide what proselytization and conversion might look like. And those are probably not so much entering into the equation when we're talking about really royal one-offs in these manuscripts that were extremely expensive, deluxe.
And I suppose in terms of well, feeding into the idea of the visuals being an expansion on text or found in manuscripts, how commonly have images of the prophet been historically used as a form of Quranic exegesis?
Yeah, that's something I've thought about a lot. It fascinates me actually, because my colleagues who work on tafsir have written about how tafsir is essentially a form of explication of a holy text where the verses can be extremely opaque. So the explanation has to not be just word by word, but a meaning of a sentence and then the sentence within a narrative framework. My colleague Wali Saleh talks a lot about hermeneutical or exegetical fabulation. Of course, fabulation is telling stories through this exegetical lens. For me, what has been interesting to see from those who specialize in tafsir, which is, this exegetical fabulation, is that the images can do the same thing. So, for example, when we think about all the images of the Prophet Muhammad's celestial ascension, right, his mi'raj, those images and the text that go with it are, in essence, very long, elaborate textual and visual explanations of a single verse in the Quran, right? That's verse 1 of chapter 17, the Ayat al-Isra, which is very opaque. For those who know that verse is, blessed be the one who made his servant travel by night from Al-Masjid al-Haram, so right, the taboo or sacred mosque, which is easily interpretable as Mecca, to Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, which literally means the most
First
faraway place
mosque.
of frustration. But, during the period of the Quran, Al-Masjid al-Aqsa, the Aqsa Mosque, the Dome of the Rock, none of these structures existed. And so how does one actually start to explain these verses in a narrative framework? And so then we have these long sort of tales of the mirage that emerge, but how can we tell them even in a more engaging way? Well, maybe we can make them fully illustrated like a graphic novel and really harness the power of both text and image. And so you see images being used as a form of exegesis of scripture. And that holds true also for the process of asbab and nuzul, so the occasions of revelation. There are lots of images of the Prophet Muhammad engaging in battles. And oftentimes the text explains then the condition of that battle for the revelation of very particular verses of the Quran that govern war or the spoils or division of spoils. And that can accompany an image as well. So that really is about just warfare. And so it's interesting to really think about not just tafsir as text, but tafsir as image as well, because that's another form of explication which relies on and marshals the visual mode.
Yeah, Tafsir as image is something that I found fascinating after reading your book. It's not anything that I would have associated with Islamic art. And it is something that I'm hoping to look further into because I find it to be, I mean, fascinating to look at Islamic art as such. And so as we prepare to look at some of the pictures that you've shared with us, but we'll share with our audience, what should we keep in mind in terms of their original purpose or audience? Were these primarily devotional, educational, political, and how might understanding the context help us approach them today, not just as art, but as a part of a broader Islamic visual tradition?
That's a great question. So the images that we're going to chat through today are all from the first few decades of the 14th century. And so that's what we want to keep in mind. We are going to be dipping back 700 years, more than 7 centuries. And so whatever we think we know today, we kind of have to reverse engineer and pivot out of our own personal knowledge and actually shift ourselves to really adapt to the images. That's the first thing I'd like to say, and that's what the historian does, right? They shift out of themselves to pivot to the historical evidence. The paintings are from illustrated manuscripts, so they're embedded in books. They're painted by hand. They were made in Iran, around the area of Tabriz, which is in northwestern Iran, not too far from the Armenian border. This period, the first few decades of the 14th century, sees the full and final implantation of Islam as the faith of the ruling elite. At this moment, the ruling elite, the dynasty, is the Ilkhanids, and they're of Mongol extraction. Up until that point, and still during that moment, right, the 14th century, there is a fluctuation of religion in Iran. There's a strong Jewish community, there's a strong Nestorian Christian community, there's an Armenian community, there are Georgians. And so what I want us to keep in mind is that we are in Iran. This is Persian culture, but it's also Mongol, Central Asian, Chinese, Armenian. It captures and telescopes that really interesting dynamic rapids where things are not chiseled in stone and they're not easily taxonomized, right? It's hard to sort things out into easy categories, which we have a tendency to do. So I'd like us to stay with the trouble in a sense, because history is troubled, and that's where things happen to be most interesting, rich, and diverse. So that's what I want us to keep in mind. All right, so let's start from the very beginnings, which is the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. As you can see here, this text right here is in the Edinburgh University Library. It's known as the Jami' Tawarikh, or Compendium of Chronicles, and it was penned by the Ilkhanid vizier Rashid ad-Din, who's very famous. And the text is incredibly important because it's considered to be the first a universal history. So he attempted to give a whole history of the world in this text. And part of the history of the world is the history of Islam, and part of the history of Islam is the history of the Prophet Muhammad.
Is that
So
where Rashid al-Din starts with the history of the Prophet, or does he predate the Prophet's birth in any of his illustrations or?
there's much more that comes before Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, and that includes ancient prophetic history. So Moses is the story of Moses is depicted, Abraham. So there's a long line of prophetic history that's also written about and illustrated in this manuscript.
Okay.
So Prophet Muhammad's prophetic history comes as part of a longer prophetic history in the Jami' Tawarikh. Great question. Where it comes, though, here in the history of the Prophet Muhammad, which is in the history of Islam, it comes right after this chapter, and every chapter is marked dhikr, which is a notice or a section or a recollection, right? So you can tell every chapter by the term dhikr. This chapter right here, you can see in the rubrication, which means red ink, right? A rubric is something that's marked in red ink at the beginning of a section that reads that this is about the marriage of Abdullah to Amina, the mother of the Prophet. Peace and prayers be upon him. So we're getting to the point where Abdullah marries Amina, and after they get married, Amina becomes pregnant and she gives birth to the Prophet. And that's when we start the chapter here, chapter on the birth of the Prophet, peace and prayers be upon him. So I'm going to zoom into that image. And this is the image that accompanies a pretty thorough text describing the Prophet Muhammad's birth. Rashid ad-Din is very interested in establishing right before the painting the exact year of the Prophet's birth because there was no Hijri calendar at the time, right? That doesn't start until the Prophet Muhammad's hijrah. So he's trying to figure out per various calendrical systems exactly when the Prophet Muhammad was born. And after that, figuring out of the calendar comes this painting, which has nothing to do with the calendar. Instead, what we see here is the newborn Prophet Muhammad. He's swaddled. You can see his facial features. He has no flaming halo. But we know that he's more than a regular baby because he's being held by angels. So one angel here is lifting him up, and a second angel seems to be holding what is probably a censer, so something that exuding a beautiful smell, maybe an olfaction that has to do with prophecy. So Muhammad is not born like a regular baby. He's born into angelic spheres, as his mother Amina here reclines. She's just given birth. She's tended to. This is possibly Abdul Muttalib or Abdullah. And here you see groups of three individuals, three women here. These are maid servants probably who are tending to the Prophet. The manuscript eventually landed in India, probably was part of the Mughal book atelier, and it's at that point most likely that this inscription was added after the fact. So maybe 200 or 300 years after the painting, somebody came in, maybe the owner of the manuscript, came in and wrote, "This is the glorious birth of the ruler of mankind, peace be upon him." So it's actually not just an identification of the scene, the birth of the prophet, but it has all of these laudatory epithets. It's not just the birth of the prophet, it's a glorious birth of the ruler of mankind. And so it's got this extra layer of praises to it that are epigraphically inscribed. Do you have any questions about this painting before I move on to comparison? Anything that captures your eyes?
I actually had a question about the comparison, but I was going to wait till you go to the comparison.
Okay, what you'll see here that you won't see in the comparison is that this painting is divided into three different areas. So you have one area here, another in the middle, and a third here. And so you've got these three different parts that are marked off by columns. So it's a tripartite painting. And in Byzantine traditions, you have icons that are known as triptychs, which means three panels. And sometimes the side panels can close and the whole thing is completely shut. And then you can open it again. So you have a triptych format here, which scholars before me have proposed is actually a Christian format for the painting.
Mm,
And they've also proposed before me, and I elaborate upon this, that the nativity scene of the Prophet Muhammad is possibly and quite likely indebted to Christian nativity scenes. And that should not come as a surprise to us at all, because this is a cycle of religious images dedicated to a prophet. And it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, thorough cycle of images devoted to the prophet. It would make sense that some of these pre-existing visual prototypes could come in handy. And that would be even more so the case if the painter in the Il Khanid Atelier happened to be a Christian, an Armenian, for example. And here I show you a painting of Christ's Nativity, which is also from the 1300s, and was copied in Armenia, so across a little bit further north from Tabriz in Iran. And then you'll see similar kinds of motifs of a swaddled newborn, a reclining mother, some angelic protagonists. We've got two angels here, two angels here. There are no three magi in the Islamic tradition for the prophet, but the three-part, three individuals, so three magi have become three ladies. So we've got our clusters of three personages. So you see those kinds of really interesting visual overlaps. So, Taryn, did you have a question about that?
Yeah, I mean, were there any scruples about, Islamic art somewhat taking from other traditions? Was there any controversy about this, or was this just kind of accepted?
Just accepted. There isn't anything in the textual record that suggests that this might have been problematic. Um, and in general, all visual traditions tend to build upon themselves over time. So, for example, when you think about the earliest images, even of Jesus Christ, those built on the iconography of Apollo, also as, the god of the sun. And so every tradition kind of builds upon or the vocabulary that it has available to itself through artists, through templates, but then it then eventually goes on its own trajectory, and then the borders become a little bit stronger so that you can distinguish what is what. But Christian and Islamic iconography were in dialogue, and were in dialogue for quite some time. Same holds true for Central Asian Buddhist iconography for the materials made in Eastern Islamic lands.
I guess the reason. No, go
Sorry.
ahead. I was just going
Um,
to say the reason why I asked that question is because, my idea about religious identity is that the lines are like always clearly defined and that other aspects of one person's theology never creeps into another person's, or if I take something from this religion, it's not being true to my own. But just by looking at these paintings and how comfortable Islamic art was with using iconography or motifs from different traditions, I see a comfortability that I would have never otherwise thought existed.
Yeah, and think about these paintings, but also the people. So, for example, the ruler uh, to whom this manuscript is associated, his name is Olcaytu. And Olcaytu was born an Nestorian Christian, converted to Sunni Islam, then converted to Shi'i Islam, and then on his deathbed reverted back to Sunni Islam. And so we really shouldn't be surprised in an environment where there's this amount of flexibility, even among individuals who are going between religions and then going in between intra-Islamic branches, that wouldn't also be the case for the visuals. So that's what I mean by pivoting out of our own circumstances. We tend to taxonomize things with very clear borders. 700 years ago, things were much more fluid. And there was no sort of crisis of category per se in certain branches of production, including the visual mode.
I mean, in terms of these images being in conversation with each other, would the references in the prophetic painting be legible to its audience, if that makes sense?
That's a really good question. To some, it might be, to others, it might not. So, for example, for Olcaytu, um, as a former Nestorian Christian, the reference to the Nativity could have been very legible. And in fact, building upon the prototype of Jesus, elevating in a way the prototype of Muhammad to the prototype of the Nativity could have been seen as a praiseworthy move in and of itself. Just like certain elements of Muhammad's biography have Davidic motifs, so they're based on David, and others follow what scholars have called the Mosaic mold. They follow the mold or the pattern of Moses. And so you do see the mold of Jesus, of David, of Moses, sort of coming up in the biography of the prophet. But those molds are also about the heroic, right? And that's something I work with a lot in this chapter of the book. Like, how is Muhammad more than a man, but a hero? And a hero has a blessed birth. That's how the hero enters the world. And Muhammad, when he enters the world, the texts tell us that the idols at the Kaaba shattered, the parapets of Ctesiphon, right? The Sasanian palace came crumbling down. That when he was born, kind of a light emerged from Amina. You get all these texts. And here, this is not a text in the sense of words, but this text, which is visual, elevates Muhammad's birth to the level of an angelic coming into the world. You see what I mean? So those things would be legible to their audiences. So, of course, we start with the birth of the prophet. That's a good place to start for the biography. And afterwards, there are a couple more chapters, and then we land, once you foliate, you go through the book, you land on the dhikr, on the chapter that reads in red here, the beginning of Wahi or Quranic revelations to Mustafa, that's the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the beginnings of his prophetic mission. So we know that this chapter is about the beginnings of prophetic revelations, and it's about the beginning of his apostleship. The text begins by explaining the beginnings of Quranic revelations, and of course, many Islamicists will be able to tell you that Quranic revelations began when Muhammad was going into seclusion. He went to the cave at Mount Hira. There, the angel Gabriel approached him. Gabriel ordered or commanded him to recite in the name of the Lord, which is this major ayah. Many historians, Rashid included, are very interested in establishing again the exact day of the beginning of Quranic revelations. And so you'll see in larger script right here a line that talks about the month of Ramadan, which is when the beginnings of Quranic revelations were launched during a night that's known as Laylat al-Qadr, or the night of power. And when exactly in the month of Ramadan was that is always something that's up for discussion. And then he goes on to say that the Quran is in fact a guidance for mankind, and it's known as Al-Furqan, which is the criterion or the example or the proof or the evidence, and the Quran is the proof or the divider between good and evil. So we see here Ramadan, Quran, and Furqan, which all sound similar, being marshaled as an explanation. And to go with the beginnings of Quranic revelation, we have this image, which is almost like a thumb piece when you think about it. And it captures the beginning of Wahi, the beginnings of revelation. You see the Prophet Muhammad here, seated on a rocky outcrop. These rocks might suggest the cave at Mount Hira. They're kind of encircling him. He's seated with his hands on his knee. He has two long braids. His hair plates are talked about in the textual sources. Some authors say he had two hair plates, some say four, two in the front, two in the back. What I found really interesting about these hair plates, and this is a conversation that I had just recently over the last year or two with the conservators at the Edinburgh University Library, is that if you look really closely, these braids, somebody went in at a later date and applied a really thick black paint. This is not the original pigment. That pigment wore off with time. This is kind of a sloppy black pigment. The same has happened with the angel Gabriel's hair. And so it's going to be very interesting to do some light penetrative photography of some sort. And the question is, when were these overpainted? Maybe during the Mughal period, because the plates are really important as physical characteristics, as the shama'il of the prophet. And so rather than execrating the picture and inveighing it of idolatry, Mughal Muslim artists and viewers wanted to re-emphasize the painting, right? And those plates. So I find that super interesting. And just like every inquiry, every right skepsis, there's still work to be done to really understand that layer of addition to the painting.
On
In
the
Go ahead.
Sorry, on the topic of audience, who are these illustrated texts for? You mentioned that they weren't for the average person. So who were the audience to these to this artwork? I mean, was it courtly, private? Did someone pull these things out during a party and we had to pass them around? Yeah, that's just something I'm curious about.
That's a great question. So this is a royal manuscript. So it belongs to the Ilkhanid ruler, the Sultan. Oftentimes, I think they were not just making it for themselves to learn history, but if they want their children and princes and princesses to also learn history, a good way to teach history is through illustrations, like an illustrated history book, right? But also adults love images, and we all of us, at least I do. I really like reading graphic novels. It's a nice way of learning to toggle between a text and an image because an image can say something the text doesn't, and vice versa. So it's probably the Sultan, his family. Kids might find this enjoyable, and they might learn history better. They might actually remember the verses. Ikra bi ismi rabbike. Maybe they'll remember that better if they remember this gesture of Gabriel pointing his index finger saying, Ikra, recite. And so you can kind of see that physical locomotion within the painting. At the same time, you also mentioned, were these taken out and sort of passed around at a party? And we do know that illustrated manuscripts would be opened at a page with a painting, and it wasn't necessarily a private reading, but you could actually pass this manuscript around in a mejlis, so in a reading session. And there you'd have more people, but it still wouldn't be huge, right? You're not talking about more than a few dozen people at most. Maybe an image like this was opened up and that text was read on Laylat al-Qadr, right? Maybe this painting was brought out not just as an educational tool to explain the beginnings of Quran, not just as a historical explanation for the biography of the Prophet, but maybe it was taken out during a ritual moment of festivity. Laylat al-Qadr is very important in the month of Ramadan. Maybe it was open and that portion of the text read. It would be educational, but at the same time, it could be used to increase devotion, and it could help memorize the Quran. So these images have many different purposes and uses, and that's what makes them interesting.
Were there any moralizing aspects to this? I mean, would this category of artwork, along with the narrations, fit in the genre of guidance for princes or anything like that?
In some cases, I think so. This is, of course, the mirrors for princes phenomenon, and even though we don't necessarily see it clearly in this image, in the books of ascension, the Prophet Muhammad's ascension, we know in the text, right, that the Prophet Muhammad went to heaven and then he went to hell. And oftentimes hell is depicted, and there are lots of images of hell. And Muhammad sees all of these different people being tortured for various sins, for engaging in hypocrisy, stealing the wealth of orphans, backbiting, whatever it may be. And that, yes, definitely that would be a mirrors for princes, because if you have a young audience and you're showing them back to back all of these images of people being tortured to hell because, they were backbiting or they're engaging in hypocrisy or stealing the wealth of orphans, that's actually a moral upbringing. That this is your way of teaching someone not to engage in that kind of negative behavior. So definitely there's a mirrors for princes there.
And is there a reason why certain pigments would have worn away faster than other pigments?
Yes, some pigments become what codicologists and conservators call fugitive, because they start to detach and fly away from the painting. So fugitive pigments oftentimes fly away or degrade because of overzealous handling or because somebody's trying to destroy the picture. And so the question that has to be posed, especially for Muhammad's braids, if Muhammad's face isn't the target of excision or smudging, right? If Muslims who owned this manuscript for centuries didn't go in and try to destroy Muhammad's face, were they potentially, out of affection, maybe rubbing his hair or kissing his hair? And we do know that there was a practice of devotional kissing, which is known as devotional osculation. That's the term for kissing, of images in many traditions, including Islamic traditions. But if you kiss with your saliva or if you rub, you're going to unfortunately and quite ironically damaged that painting. And so maybe Muhammad's hair plates were the target of um, overzealous devotional engagement, so much so that the pigments became fugitive, and somebody later on decided, we basically have to restore his braids, and that's why we see that kind of sloppy black pigment. There are other reasons why the pigments might fall off. That could be maybe water damage, right? Or the painting could be rubbing against something. And I love that you asked this question because there's still some scientific analysis to be done of this painting. And the conservators pointed out for me just last year, and nobody seems to have worked on this yet. If you look carefully, these rocks are super fuzzy. Notice how it looks kind of out of focus, this blue right here and here. So all these blue areas seem a little bit pixelated or out of focus. And that's because if you looked very closely, and you can't really see it to the naked eye, somebody went in and applied a gauze on top of the pigments to stabilize them so they wouldn't fall off anymore. And that's most likely not a previous Muslim owner, but earlier conservators in the earlier part of the 20th century at the Edinburgh University Library. And so, right, this painting was the center of the Hamline controversy, which and certain actors wanted this painting not to be taught, not to exist. But if you look at the painting, it was made by a Muslim for a Muslim with devotional appeal, with potential devotional engagements with the braids, which led another potentially Muslim artist and owner to want to restore it. And then eventually it came into a scientist's hands, a library, and that person then added gauzes to preserve it. So the painting itself, if we look at it from a historical perspective, has layers and layers of preservation, which is very different from what we see happened at Hamline, which is a layer of excision. So that's where the historical data is not matching our current circumstances. So one of the major episodes also in the youth, the childhood of the Prophet Muhammad is that at one point he went on a caravan trip with his uncle, Abu Talib, and they went to Syria to a town whose name is Busra. Busra, like many other towns in Syria, was a Christian town and it had a monastery. And a monk lived in that monastery, and his name is often given as Bahira or Buhair. You see both names used in the sources. And the texts tell us that when Muhammad was just a child, when he arrived at that monastery, some really interesting phenomena happened, which made it so that Bahira was able to see the signs of prophecy on the young Prophet Muhammad before he even got the Quranic revelations. This is what Anne-Marie Schimmel calls a Berufungserlebnis in German, which is a kind of initiatory experience. And so here we see the Prophet Muhammad, who hasn't been initiated into prophethood yet because he's young, and yet he's been recognized. So it's also a recognition trope. The chapter is about that trip and his recognition as a prophet before he's even a prophet. So we have that whole tale, and then follows the painting. And the painting basically depicts what has happened with Bahira in his monastery. Over here, he's got a deacon next to him, probably, or a helper, and he is pointing his finger over to the young prophet Muhammad. And he's basically able to recognize him. And he says, protect him, make sure he doesn't get killed. he's a future prophet. So it's this recognition of a future prophet, a kind of annunciation of his prophecy. And Muhammad, once again, is not just a human child. He's more than a mortal. His body, his face haven't been manipulated. I think his tresses were again painted in later on because they might have kind of disappeared, the pigment. And here, not only the reason we know that he's not just a young boy, but a future prophet is because of this element, a visual element,
I
which
thought it
is
was really cool looking.
this one's is great, and it's not really it's not described in the text, and this is where the paintings really help elaborate upon the text. Some texts say that a tree bent over and its branch created a shade for the prophet. So you have, or a cloud passed over under the sun and made a shade. So you have these natural phenomena that are seen that shade and protect the prophet. But here it's the firmament, the blue sky that gets distended, and then this angel comes out of the distended sky and holds what looks like a perfume flask in one hand, and then a scroll, a rolled up parchment or paper in the other. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are those two metaphors? One could be the scent of prophecy. So he's being anointed. And right, anointment is mesaha, right? Mesih. So he's the anointed prophet and he comes bearing the scent of prophecy. So it's an anointment of sorts.
Would they have tried to scent that part of the picture, maybe like Muhammad's face or the vase that's being poured? Would they have tried to add some kind of scent to it to kind of give it that effect?
That's a great question. This is kind of like the scratch and sniff
Yeah, that's
question.
exactly what I said to Roxana this morning.
Not
Yeah.
that's a great question. And as far as I know, there's no scratch and sniff going on here. But there are other paintings that depict the Prophet Muhammad with roses in particular. And we do know of the concept Güle Muhammed in the Ottoman Turkish tradition, so the rose of the Prophet. And there are recipes from the Ottoman palace, Topkapı Palace, where a rose water is added into a recipe and it's referred to as the rose of the Prophet.
Mm.
And so the rose is very closely associated with the prophet. Not just the flower, but the color, because rose is pink and pink is between white and red. White is the light of divinity, red is the red of the blood clot of humanity. Muhammad is this in between where the light of divinity, revelation, meets the sanguinity of the mortal man, ergo pink, right? So, but we don't really have are riffing on pink in this case, but we do have this scroll, which is most likely the metaphor for divine revelation. So Muhammad is here endowed with these external attributes or metaphors that make him recognizable as a prophet, even though he's not a prophet when he's in his youth, but it's recognizable. And all of the humans and even the camels kind of create this orbit, this circumrotational movement
I was
around.
about to mention that. It seems like things are somewhat prostrating to, or at least bending towards him.
Everything bends towards him. The gesture of Bahira, the camels that prostrate to him, their camel loads, these are the sacks for the caravan, even they seem to be magnetically inclined towards him. The sky descends to him. All the humans are there almost like witnesses to something that hasn't happened but has been foretold. And so, what's fascinating about this image is that it has a dynamic impact. You have this kind of orbit around the prophet, and you can't help but see him as the viewer because everything in that painting has been planned to draw your eye straight to that central node. And that's the head of the Prophet Muhammad that's being anointed with heavenly scent and revelation from God. But nothing has been altered inside his body. So he still is a physical human being with a face that's fully visible, and he has no flaming halo either. So that's the earliest images.
In terms of what we just mentioned about sort of the idea of touching pink paintings or olfactory symbols, and obviously we have the visual and the textual and everything. How much of the of experiencing this painting for the viewers would have been multi-sensory, if that makes sense. Like, would there have been some in some sort of also you might be listening to maybe Quranic recitation or while viewing these works or whatever. Is there an element of that sort of being an I don't know how to phrase this, an ability for the viewer to experience the prophet in this multi-sensory format?
That's a great question. There's a big project on the Islamic senses that my colleague Christian Lange is leading out of Utrecht, right? And so there's a lot now moving into sensorial history and the entire sensorium. So these are really pressing questions and they're being taken up. So here we have to engage in kind of an imaginative scenario, right? To see how this could have happened. You have a manuscript. It's being read. Oftentimes you might read out loud, so you have a sonic experience. Part of the sonic experience of reading the manuscript includes reading the Quranic verses that are explained, which means you're also reciting the Quran along the way.
Mm.
And so you're looking also at Quranic recitation along with textual narration in out loud. That might be by one voice, but if you're in a majlis situation, as we mentioned before, then you might have 10 people reciting the same Quranic verse several times, creating a kind of responsorial activity that's multivocal. And so then you've got this multivocality that's encircling the image. If it's in a majlis situation or even in a library, you might have incense burning which actually keeps pests away, right? And you don't want worms eating your manuscripts or moths. So incense is very useful as a fumigator. But at the same time, what if you have rose water that's being poured on hands? Because you want to handle also the manuscript with clean hands. So you're washing your hands, maybe there's rose water, maybe you're smelling the rose on your hand, maybe you're smelling the incense, maybe you're hearing a textual narration, but maybe many people are reciting the Quran. And then you add to that all those senses, the sonic, the visual, you might even have the touch here, right? You might be touching the manuscript. And then I've talked about this in another article. What if you're kissing the image? What if it's devotional osculation? If you kiss it accidentally, one or two flecks of pigment might actually end up in your mouth. That leads to questions of ingestion, right? And so then that opens up a whole other realm of questioning. In later years, in the 18th, 19th century, do have bottles that are made in Ottoman lands that have a hilya or an iconic icon of the Prophet Muhammad that might have been used to create a kind of precipitate, a gold precipitate that would be mixed in with water and then imbibed to kind of activate maybe an inner Muhammad. That then the Prophet Muhammad, metaphorically, if we think of it as these images as metaphors, becomes epigenetically part of your own experience. Like you might feel that you understand the prophet better if all of the senses are marshaled in this kind of experiential moment. This is all very sort of critical fabulation, kind of an imaginative exercise, but it's always interesting to think about potential scenarios. So this too, right? This distension of the firmament with the coming down of something that suggests that the protagonist is more than just human, we also see in Armenian depictions, not only of Christ's birth. You might remember there was kind of a star coming down on Christ in the Armenian depiction. In this case, I'm showing you a depiction of Christ's baptism by Saint John. Here's Saint John. Here's Christ being baptized. And you'll notice that the firmament has been distended and out comes a dove that represents the Holy Spirit. That would not have much currency in an Islamic register. Yeah, you're not going to do much with the Holy Spirit, but you can show a distended firmament and then convey what it is that you want to convey in an Islamic context of meaning about the Prophet Muhammad, which is that he's anointed by God and he carries Quranic revelation. So you can change your motif, but the distension of the firmament with a kind of angelic entity, whether it's an angel or the Holy Spirit as a dove, you can see kind of those two motifs overlapping. It's not a one-to-one, it's more of a parallel.
Mm. As well as I see that all of the figures are kind of leaning towards Jesus and yeah, much like the one that we see with the Prophet Muhammad, the camels and his entourage. Uh, so yeah, I'm definitely seeing it's not a one-to-one like you mentioned, but I'm definitely seeing a lot of similarities.
Exactly. You know, and I call that orbicular because it creates an orbit around the protagonist. So it's an orbicular composition. And scientists have shown that when we read in a particular direction, depending on the script and language. But when we see in the round. So, for example, you know, if you were looking at me, you would not read me up and down or side to side. Your eyes actually do a full rotation to understand the entire picture.
Mm.
So, you know, visually speaking, it's very important to have that orbicular composition because that's also how the eye functions and understands what's before it. It's a different way of functioning. We're not usually aware or conscious that our eyes are going in the round, but they're constantly shifting like that.
You know, me and Roxana were discussing. We had a question, or we were thinking about something earlier. So, in terms of Christian paintings, would this Christ baptism, would that be like one of the most famous of Christian artwork with the Nativity? Or like I was telling Roxana, in a lot of Black American households, we had the Last Supper. So I would have thought the Last Supper would have been uh, so yeah, I guess it might be a little off of the subject a bit, but what is the most popular, Christian painting style? Baptism, Nativity, Last Supper.
So in pre-modern manuscripts, The Last Supper is not as popular. It becomes more popular in these standalone big canvas paintings, you know, from the Renaissance period onward, if you're thinking about Da Vinci and company, right? Um, so in manuscripts, the most recurrent depictions, there are many, but the most recurrent are Christ's nativity, his entry into Jerusalem, his resurrection, his raising of Lazarus, which is a major miracle, right? Raising of the dead, his baptism, and his crucifixion.
Mm.
Right? I mean, the Christ on the cross is a major motif, the crucifixion in Christianity. You will not see the crucifixion, however, depicted in any depiction of Christ in Islam. There are depictions of Jesus Christ, plenty of them. He's a prophet, just not the crucifixion, because that is not a belief that's held in Islamic spheres.
Does
That Christ.
Islamic spheres, do they all have like the same styles that you just mentioned before pre-modern? In pre-modern times, have Islamic artists styled the prophet using the same caveats or same style as such as, I mean, obviously the nativity, but say of something, the prophet entering into Mecca,
Mm,
same as Jesus entering in Jerusalem. Um,
totally different. Yeah. There are some things where you can see that there's a bit of a motif overlap, right? Or a parallel, and then you can see those parallels. But there are plenty of moments in the Prophet Muhammad's life, including his entry into Mecca or his destruction of the idols, that don't have a parallel in other stories, either of David or Moses or Jesus. And there, the artist really has to come up with a different format, a different composition. So that's more creative rather than, aha, this template also kind of works for me.
So there was a certain level of originality
Oh,
to Islamic art. It's not just all, because I don't want the audience to think that it was all just, borrowing or using from other traditions, but that, Islamic artists also had a certain originality about themselves.
of course. And even if you see some parallels or borrowings, like you do in this case for the Bahira scene, the artist had to be very creative, had to include the Prophet Muhammad depicted per Islamic conventions, right, with a robe, a turban, had to depict a caravan, an Arab caravan, had to depict camels, right? So had to depict something endowing the Prophet with more than just his humanity, but how to do that. And here you can see them really being creative. How are we going to do that? And that's a really creative intervention, this angel right here. Um, Although the idea of an angel coming out of the firmament might not be entirely new. And so with every single creativity, you do have something that might be undergirding it. And that's what we call, right, the invention of tradition in a way. You know, something looks traditional, but it's because we invent things over and over again.
Right.
So there's an inventiveness always, and it's never just blind copying. It's much more than that. So I mentioned when we talked about tafsir and exegesis that the ayah that basically around which all of the Miraj story is eventually woven is Quran 17:1. So Ayat al-Isra. And it gets really elaborated, and sometimes you have entire books of ascension with over 50 paintings. But in the case of the Jami' at-Tawarikh, now we're in the chapter of the Prophet Muhammad's celestial ascension. So this happened in the middle of his prophetic career, so it's not an end-of-life resurrection, so it's very different from the story of Jesus Christ. So in the middle of his prophetic career, the angel Gabriel comes to him and says, you know, you're going to come with me. We're gonna go up to the skies. And oftentimes the tales say that Muhammad, and I can zoom in here, rode from Mecca to Jerusalem. That's his sort of horizontal, kind of terrestrial Isra or night journey. And then he had a vertical ascension, which is the Mi'raj proper from Jerusalem to the skies, and that he was on the back of this human-headed, winged flying steed known as Al-Buraq, which you see here. And this is one, probably the earliest depiction. Let me think. It's the earliest depiction I know of Buraq. We're talking 13,
Hmm.
14. And so it's a very interesting composition. Buraq is a steed. Usually Buraq later on has wings because Buraq flies. Burak is not male or feminine, but oftentimes Burak is referred to as a dabba, so a mule or a vehicle for transportation, a beast of burden. And dabba, linguistically, as you know, is feminine. So sometimes Burak has feminine characteristics, but here it's impossible to tell. So it's a it in a way. Burak has a human face and a human torso, human arms that hold a closed book. And you'll notice, and this is the only Burak that's depicted like this, its tail doesn't transform into a peacock tail, which you see quite frequently, but instead transforms into a kind of mercenary angel that holds a sword and a shield.
Yeah, I noticed that as well. I was about to, you mentioned it in your book, but yeah, it's a bit mind-boggling. I've never seen Barack, pictured like that. It took me by surprise.
And that's where we see that not just the prophet, his iconography shifts over time, right? There's a development, but there's also a development for the iconography of Burak, which is described as bearing a human face, you know? Um, but here the human face is also torso and arms. And then the text itself here of the Ascension, Rashiduddin's text and other texts on the Mirage say that when he was going towards the heavens, that he had to face a series of trials that would divert him off course. And those are known as the tempting voices. And you might have heard about this. Like there's a voice of Christianity that's calling him. There's a voice of Judaism calling him. The voice of Zoroastrianism calling him. The voice
Wealth,
of
power,
wealth of the world. What? What did you say?
wealth, power,
All these things, these
all these
voices.
distractions that still distract us to this day. Not trying to say that Christianity or Judaism or Zoroastrian does that, but wealth and power definitely a huge distraction. So,
Exactly. So all the waswas, all the whispering of Satan in different forms to draw him off course. And so this is a trial, and he has to keep steady and stay on the straight line, as-sirat al-mustaqim, right? He can't see to any of these the temptation of these voices. And the Sirat al-Mustaqim, so the straight path, is the Quran. And so what's super interesting for me in this image, when you think about how you can interpret a lexicon, is that Muhammad is firmly on Burak. He's going forward on the straight path. The straight path is the Quran. This is likely the Quran, parts of which were revealed on the night of his ascension, by the way, when we talk about asbab and nuzul, right? The occasions for revelation. And he's ignoring all of these evil, devilish voices. And it could be that the tail of Burak is, in fact, the embodiment of all of those fighting voices that want to draw him off course and maybe even destroy him. So you have kind of an ifrit or kind of demonic feature hovering behind, but obviously it's hovering behind. So he's making it. And the last part of the trial to overcome those tempting voices as he's about to embark on his heavenly ascension is another trial or tribulation, which is known as the testing of the cups. And the texts vary substantially. Either there are 2 cups, 3 cups, or 4 cups. If there are 4 cups, it's a cup of water, a cup of wine, a cup of honey, and a cup of milk, which are presented to him. And he has to pick the cup of milk and drink that cup because that's the purest substance and the first substance that enters a baby's body from his mother. And when he drinks the milk from the cup, he's proven that he has the right fitra or constitution to enter into prophecy. So think of it as an anointment or a passing of a test. And so in this painting, Muhammad is passing all of these tests, the tempting voices, these cups, so that he can be admitted into this door, which is into heaven, so that he can have his heavenly ascension.
Mm.
And so in the end, this painting, come to think of it, is as a way to imagine all of those temptations that might draw you off course. But like the Prophet Muhammad, you have to stay steady and go on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, which is Al-Quran, which is the Furqan, right? The criterion also.
In this trial of cup,
Yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that this trial of cups is something that would have been, I don't want to say familiar, but something that the Mongol rulers or elites would have recognized because they had certain cup traditions.
Mhm.
Do the paintings of the cups in these, in the Islamic art that we're looking at, does that speak to anything about those Mongol traditions, or is it just something that are, happen to be very similar, that Mongols had traditions of drinking and Islam has this trial of cups in the history of Muhammad.
That's,
Um,
yeah. That's a great question. I think I've got a couple more, and I'll show you why this question is so interesting.
okay.
Because in the Mongol period, not just in the Jama Tawarikh, but also in this fragmentary Mirajnameh or Book of Ascension, and only the images survive in an album here in Istanbul in Topkapı Palace. So the text has been lost, the images were salvaged, they were pasted onto folios. These are paste downs too. These waves have nothing to do with the original painting, so they're all kind of preserved in this album.
Mm,
This was made 1 or 2 decades after the Jama' Tawarikh. We're still in the early decades of the 1300s. And here you have a depiction of the Prophet's Miraj, the moment when he arrives in Jerusalem. This is most likely, this is after the fact, right? It represents the Dome of the Rock. Here's the rock. The Dome of the Rock is not built at the moment of his ascension, but this is, 1330, so it's an imagination of the Dome of the Rock. So here's our rocky outcrop. He gets to Jerusalem where he serves as the imam and he leads all the other ancient prophets in prayer. Burak is tied up to one of the columns. You'll notice there's a little wing here. I should have a detail maybe. Let's see. There we go. You can see better here. So Burak has a coral body, an emerald ear. It's made of these different substances, a kind of fluttery wing here. And you'll notice that Muhammad is in the central position. He's kind of larger than everybody else. And if you look closely, he's actually being offered by 2 angels. Here's one angel. Here's the second. 1, 2, 3, 4 cups.
mm,
So he's undergoing the testing of the cups in Jerusalem as he becomes the primus inter pares, the leader of leaders, and he's recognized as the last prophet and the most preeminent prophet by all other prophets that came before in the city of the prophets, which is Jerusalem. And that testing of the cups is also depicted in other books of Ascension. Here we're skipping up a century. We're looking at the 1430s. Now we're in Timurid, Central Asia. This was most likely made in Herat, modern-day Afghanistan. So we're going towards Central Asia. This is the most famous Mirajnameh, or Book of Ascension. And that's just not necessarily the title, but the type of book. And this one has about 56 paintings. The text still survives, accompanies it. And as you go through the book, you got painting by painting by painting. And this is the testing of the cups, the 4 cups. And you'll see Muhammad here on Burak drinking from a cup, and that's the cup of milk. And so you kind of anticipated my PowerPoint, which is fantastic.
Sorry.
I love it. I mean, you're kind of onto me, I guess. Um, and I hadn't thought about this, but now I'm thinking about it, is that we have a lot of these depictions in the 1300s and 1400s, and we're looking at a Mongol Turkic period right here, right? Where the prime is placed on the testing of the cups. And as you mentioned, the Mongols had cup rituals, including the drinking of the blood of horses upon ascension to the throne. And so there were cup rituals that are well known for the Mongols. And so when you talk about ascending to the throne through a cup ritual for a Mongol, it could be that they found the cup as an ascension into prophecy, a really interesting template that would be recognizable and maybe even endow them with more legitimacy through the prophetic exemplum. So I had never thought about that until your question. And then putting our images together, that could have a resonance in this time and place, for sure.
Can I ask the figure in the upper right picture, the one that's just behind the prophet, who almost seems larger than everybody else? This, that
Mhm.
one. Who is
Yeah,
that?
that's most likely Jesus because we're in Jerusalem right here. And I do want to point out for you something else. You know, when we talk about fugitive pigments, conservation, and so on, you might have noticed that the Prophet Muhammad's face looks a little bit white and worn out.
Mhm.
Right.
And that's the case also in this other painting, which is from the same fragmentary Mirajnameh, which shows the Prophet who is down here praying. He's uh, grasping his hands in a prayer position as the angel Gabriel points up to this celestial rooster, which is known as the Dik al-Arsh, or the rooster of the throne of God. And the rooster sounds the call, 5 times a day. So this angelic rooster is the angel of the 5 daily prayers. Here the rooster is identified with a tiny little inscription, which you probably can't see very well, that says Horos, or Horos, which is Persian, Turkic, and other languages, which just means rooster. So there's an ID on him. And then you'll notice that this group of angels are raising their hands in prayer, the Rafal Yadain. And so all of them are praying either by grasping their hands or raising their hands. And that represents actually the 5 daily prayers. Now, Muhammad's face here too, you will notice, is quite damaged, right?
Right.
And the reason for that, and you asked, why would pigments disappear, leads me to this very final point, because this is the last slide in my PowerPoint, is that in this case, it's not because of devotional rubbing. This is an Ilkhanid painting. It was made in the 1320s or 30s, probably. But it arrived and was preserved in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul and became the property of the Ottoman sultans. When it came into Ottoman hands, sometime maybe in the 16th or 17th century, an artist in the palace atelier was probably tasked with organizing and preserving the album. And when that artist, Ottoman artist, saw images of the Prophet, he went in and added white facial veils on the
Mm,
Prophet Muhammad's face in the 16th or 17th century. And when these images were first published a long time ago by the art historian Richard Eddinghausen, if you look at that article, all the images of the Prophet Muhammad have a white facial veil on him. After that, the conservators looked at the paintings in the palace and they surely had a very interesting discussion. Do we keep these veils because they're Ottoman original, or do we remove them because they're not original to the Ilkhanid painting? It's always really interesting to listen to these uh, discussions by conservators. What is original? Because here we have chains of contribution.
right.
And they ended up making the executive decision to remove those Ottoman period white facial veils because they were not original
Mm,
to the painting. And so the damage here, the reason we have pigments that have become fugitive is because there was the original painting from the 1300s, Ilkhanid, no facial veil. Ottoman period, 16th, 17th century, where prophetic iconography has changed and Muhammad gets a facial veil pretty frequently by that moment, 300 years later or so, facial veils get added. 20th century conservators come along and they go, that's not original, we're taking them off. And as they remove them, they, of course, can't help but damage the original pigment to a certain extent. And so, as we kind of wrap up this part of our discussion with the PowerPoint, it's really important to keep in mind that a painting is never static, that like humans, it has a biography that has, kind of layers of skin. And just like humans, it might have cracks, it might have wrinkles, but those all tell a really interesting tale, much more interesting than yes, images exist or no, they should be prohibited because these images have incredible life stories and tales to tell, much more than we in our 100 years of existence. Sometimes it's 1,000 year historical tale, and we just have to apply our eyes and listen to it carefully.
And that's why in the introduction I mentioned that when it comes to this kind of art, there's way more to it than what meets the eye. We definitely need art historians to kind of unpack these things because as much as I enjoy looking at this beautiful picture, I only surface level will I understand exactly what's going on. I mean, and the way that you've been able to unpack that, and I have a curious, I'm curious about the posture of the hands. I know you mentioned in your book that the way hands are positioned in these paintings also represent something of importance. In this one, I see that, the angels, they're doing the usual two hands up, which is a valid form of prayer. And then I also see the Prophet Muhammad having his hands clasped over his chest, which is also a valid form of prayer. I wonder if that speaks to anything about the different modes of prayer that, Muslims might find amongst each other, and that if I have a brother-in-law who said, "Oh man, I was at the mosque the other day. I seen this guy praying with his hands down. I don't even know if his prayers are valid." And so, I wonder if there was that kind of debate going on in the Ilkhanid period when, a lot of elites were. More and more people were converting to Islam in the elite class, and so maybe certain things weren't as definite or imprinted in the minds of these new converts. So yeah, if you could just, am I on the ball with that, or am I these are
You're
just
you're
fantasies of
you're
mine?
you're again like, totally on the mark. You're just always hitting the nail on the head with this one too, because I've actually written an article which you haven't read because it wasn't part of our discussions about this manuscript, and I spent a lot of time talking about these prayer gestures. Because as you know, probably better than me, I mean, there's a long discussion on qabd, right? The grasping of the hands, raf al yedain, postures in prayer, sujud, qiyama, rising, in prostration. So there are very interesting discussions about body postures and hand gestures in prayer. And what I find interesting with this image in particular is that it makes it evident that these multiple gestural postures in prayer are halal, are possible, the qabd and the raf al yadain. So you can use both here. And just like we talked about before, Roxana was talking about all the different senses that could be activated. Here, it's not a sense, but it's the physical locomotion could be activated too. You might actually start to stand up, raise your hands, and start reciting Quranic verses, especially if they were accompanying this painting. Now, this painting doesn't have its text with it because it's been lost. But let's imagine for a second that the rooster is actually doing the tasbih, right? Which is the subhanallah, praise be to God, because that's usually what you see in the text. And it's a litany, subhanallah, blah 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 blah, and all the honorific epithets. You could easily see the readers of the text, who are also the viewers of the image, getting up, raising their hands, and engaging in a tasbih, because that's what the rooster does. So it's an invitation to prayer. And that loops back to your question earlier about whether they're used, for education or devotion, or there was a political purpose. It's the answer would be all of the above. It really depends on circumstance. In this case, if the interactor with the manuscript is also reciting the tasbih and doing the physical and gestural prayers, then for sure this image is telescoping a form of devotion. It's not the object of prayer, right? It's not an object of idolatry, but it's helping channel that devotion in the right direction.
That was a really amazing presentation. I'm glad that you were able to unpack those for us. Of course, you sent us the slides beforehand, and we spent a considerable amount of time looking at them. But you definitely added a whole wealth of information that we got in part from your book, but from the art historian herself. So yeah, so we'll move on to segment three. And I'll let Roxana ask this question because it's one that she had thought of, and so I'll let her take it away.
Well, I wanted to ask, you've already sort of referred to them slightly in your earlier answers, in terms of how concepts of prohibition have emerged, but how much have the cartoon controversies in Denmark and France influenced contemporary discourse on Islamic anachronism in both the Western and Islamic world?
Yeah, those controversies don't seem to stop, do they? In fact, just a few weeks ago here in Istanbul, there was a cartoon by Leman, which is kind of like a Charlie Hebdo, but in Turkey, that showed the Prophet Muhammad and the Prophet Moses in a lovely discussion as, bombs were being thrown right and left.
Mm.
The government cracked down and arrested 4 people from Le Mans, and it became a big hoopla. So it's not over, and it's happening here in a Muslim majoritarian country.
Mm.
What I found really interesting is, ever since 2005, so we're on the 20th anniversary of the Jyllands-Posten Danish cartoons, is that for a long while I was extremely worried that these cartoons were really narrowing down the field of discourse, especially as it pertains to the history of creative expression in Islamic lands. That was a worry for me, because the more we start to solidify our categories of this is what Islam is and this is what is not, then we're also imperiling not just humanistic disciplines and the scholars who are studying these things, but the heritage itself. So I was very worried for a long time that the cartoons themselves were being modern, satirical, disrespectful cartoons that have their own animus, that have to be treated as such in their own socio-cultural and political context, were being lumped together with historical devotional images dedicated to the Prophet from within Islamic lands. It's apples and oranges. And yet individuals are more than happy to yoke these two unlike things together. And what we need to do and understand is that these two things are not the same. And so we have to de-lump them, right? Now, there's lumping and splitting when we talk about historical approach, and we need to split the evidence and be really precise. And so I had been worried for a long time about a narrowing of the discourse on Islamic figural imagery. Um, and I think this might be your next question, Hamlin occurred. And then with any eruption of a scandal, there's not just the negative, there's always a positive intervention that can be made. So maybe we can move on to your next question because that is actually a perfect segue too.
Yeah, well, obviously with your New Lines magazine article and the sort of change.org petition that you started, you were a very vital voice in the fallout to the Hamline University controversy. Um, to what extent has the backlash to that incident and also the subsequent lawsuit impacted academic freedom when teaching Islamic history to students? And in your view, have the widespread debates it triggered had a positive or negative long-term impact on being able to impart your expertise to students?
So, of course, when you're living through something like Hamlin, it can be very nerve-wracking because you think to yourself, is this going to be the norm? Is it safe to write about and teach what to my mind is quite banal? I'm an art historian. I happen to be a specialist of these images, and they were not a problem 20 years ago, but they've become controversial, right? And then you have to ask yourself, is it safe to teach this in the classroom? I trust my students. I've never had a problem. Why would I not trust them? And we work together. We have an allyship. I care for my students. They care for me. We care about historical evidence, and we're in this together. So it's not a pitting against, faculty versus students. I think this is a false binary that was erected over at Hamlin, that the care for the student has to trump academic freedom. That's not the way things it's not a pie. If you slice one off, right, you don't have less of it. So, but Hamlin, as difficult and problematic as it was, offered an incredible opportunity. Just like every eruptive public space, and here I'm borrowing the term of Laurie Patton. She's a very famous historian of religion. She wrote a book called Who Owns Religion, and it's about big scandals that are academic but enter the public eye. And she calls those scandals eruptive public spaces. When you have an eruption like that, or a scandal, whatever you call it, you will have voices coming in who want to claim ownership for something in a scandal. But the trick is to make sure that as a scholar, you are not spoken for or spoken down, that you don't necessarily represent a particular ideological angle, but you actually use that eruptive public space to make a public intervention. And so, to my mind, on the one hand, a number of my colleagues reached out to me and said, should I still teach my class the way I usually teach it, or should I censor myself? Should I add a trigger warning? And I just said, keep teaching exactly how you've been teaching and don't add a trigger warning because Rashida Din and his artists might find that quite offensive, actually, historically speaking. Just like I would be offended if you put a trigger warning before showing a photograph of my face. There's no offense to be taken here, but anybody can be offended by whatever they wish. And so my colleagues were worried about their teaching. And so the worries about auto or self-censorship, which is an impoverishing of the Islamic tradition. We're actually taking something away. So we become complicit. But the conversation opened up through Hamlin, and now across the world, there have been many conversations about how figural depictions of the Prophet Muhammad are in fact part of the tradition, and they should be treated on equal footing as historical images of Jesus Christ. And in every tradition, whether it's Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, there have always been anxieties about images. There have always been pro-image and anti-image parties, and we have to make sure that we convey that too, that the anxieties are real, they're historical, but they're also contemporary, but we still have to move forward with the historical work. And so I think with Hamlin, we have a really good opportunity. And it's possibly through Hamlin that you yourselves became familiar with my work. I don't know. But then that allows for this kind of conversation, and the conversations just keep things going, academically speaking. And maybe they might help advocate for Islamic heritage too, sailing forward, which is my primary interest is safeguarding and writing about the Islamic tradition, and I just so happen to do it from a textual and visual angle myself.
And in that controversy, how useful was it to have Muslim voices? I know MPAC and other Muslim organizations spoke out in favor of the professor involved in that controversy, and spoke out about how there are sort of incredibly diverse views about prophetic imagery in Islam. Were those voices helpful, and how much do they contribute to this conversation?
They were not just helpful, they're absolutely critical. You know, I cannot be a single voice because otherwise I look like a rogue element, and I don't want to be alone. Nobody shines in soliloquy. We're all in this together. It's a colloquy. And so when I was speaking up, I was actually speaking up with all my partners. And many of my partners are members of the Muslim community. And it was much more important to me on a number of occasions. And this is where it's really important to know when to speak out, and it's really important to know when to be silent. And so on many occasions, I decided when I was asked to speak out to be silent, and I actually suggested other voices to speak out. And it was very important for me to see other voices, especially from the Muslim community, speak out and speak out forcefully for a tradition that is claimed as one's own. That's for me even more important. And I think it should be for everybody.
Definitely. And there's often a perception that Islam has always maintained a strict prohibition against representing the prophet visually. And yet, as your research shows, artists over the centuries clearly found ways to navigate and even challenge those boundaries. What do you think allowed for this flourishing of imagery despite theological hesitations, as we see to a certain extent today? And how were these works justified or received within their own cultural setting? I mean, I mentioned, were there any controversies in terms of taking, from other traditions, but were the pictorial representations of the prophet in general, or in and of themselves, controversial, or did they have any bit of pushback or resistance, similar to what we kind of see today?
That's such a great question. So one answer would be that those images didn't navigate widely in the public sphere because these were deluxe editions that were in these elite settings. So it was very hard to get a reaction because practically nobody was seeing them effectively. And the same sultan who would be commissioning his artists to make something like this could also be the patron of major theologians. And at the same time, theologically speaking, or even from a jurisprudential point of view, if we're talking about law, right, fiqh, there is no single fatwa that prohibits figural imagery of the Prophet Muhammad until a Saudi Wahhabi fatwa was issued after the Danish cartoon controversy.
Mm.
And not everybody needs to follow that fatwa. You can go and see a Shi fatwa and then follow that one. And another fatwa that was Shi that came out said it's perfectly fine as long as the depictions are respectful. And so, there is no canonical law, right, as in canon, but you can seek out opinions and then you can decide which opinion you might want to follow. So there is no canonical position. And in fact, oftentimes the visual evidence shows the Prophet Muhammad in figural form destroying idolatry. Right? So we have to be very careful to distinguish between figuration and idolatry. And I've been mentioning this along the way. And so there are paintings of the Prophet Muhammad. He's in a figural mode. He's destroying idols. And there's an idolater, like a pagan Arab idolater, who's been smudged out. And so a figural painting can actually be made to drive home the fact that idolatry is forbidden. So we have to be very careful not to confuse figural imagery with devotion to the figural image. Those are two very different things, right? And so the way that also artists and their patrons could justify figural imagery, which was the last part of your question, is that they could claim various beneficial uses for images. And so, for example, that those last Ascension images that I showed you that are preserved in an album, it has a preface. And the Persian writer who created the preface, his name is Dust Muhammad. He was active in 16th century Iran. He gives the whole history of Islamic calligraphers and painters, And those paintings of the Ascension are attributed to a very famous Ilkhanid period painter whose name was Ahmed Musa, who really changed the trajectory of figuration. And then in the preface, it says that these images are beneficial, and so those who make the images should not be pricked by the thorn of despair. That's the wording, because they're beneficial. What are they beneficial for? Learning of history, educational purposes, learning the Quran, learning devotions, maybe prayer gestures. And so theologians could also justify figural imagery on various grounds. And in fact, Muhammad Abdu, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, right, during the second half of the 19th century, wrote a treatise on images. So he wrote kind of a fatwa, or an opinion on figural images on sculpture, including ancient pharaonic sculpture. And his conclusion is that it's not a problem because we need to learn about our history and we need these materials for our education. So the Grand Mufti of Egypt from the 1850s to the 1900s actually wrote an opinion, a treatise on that matter, coming on the side of yes, figural imagery is important and it fulfills an educational purpose. Plus, we need to preserve our heritage. So there's a heritage thrust there. So you see all those things entering into the fray. That's not to say that you won't find theologians and actors who will come down really hard saying, no, it's completely prohibited, and shut that down. So you have all these different positionalities and voices that will clamor for space at the eruption of a scandal.
I'm guessing that Grand Mufti was Muhammad Abdu,
That's it.
1850 to 1900. Um, And so, how much of these historical and contemporary divergent views on prophetic imagery have to do with sectarian division? And how has this sort of sectarian discourse evolved over time? You mentioned the Saudi fatwa, which happens to be a very conservative Sunni. But then you also mentioned, in Egypt, the Grand Mufti of Egypt, who was also Sunni, had no problem with such images and saw them as beneficial. And then when we look historically, in Ottoman lands, Sunni Ottoman lands, Ottomans obviously didn't have a problem with representing figural images of the Prophet, as well in Persian Shi'i lands. But now there seems to be more of a divide,
Mhm.
where Persian Shi'i communities, they don't necessarily have a problem with imaging sacred figures, whereas Sunnis, by and large, to be honest, I mean, most of the ones I come across feel like this isn't proper. Obviously, that hasn't always been. What kind of has motivated these two to kind of move further and further apart from each other?
Yeah, such a great question. It's very complicated too, because today when you ask someone, or if you put the question to ChatGPT, are there images of Muhammad in the Islamic tradition? They'll say, no, but there are exceptions. So they exist, but they don't exist. And when they exist, they're from Iran, and so they don't really count. And so what's been really interesting for me is to see that when we talk about the narrowing of discourse, more and more it's been seen as images of the Prophet are an Iranian practice, and Iran today is a Shia majority country. Whereas the no images is a more of an Arab practice and more of a Sunni practice. But then if you look at the visual evidence, of course, all this comes crumbling and it becomes much more complicated. So the Jami' Tawarikh, as I mentioned before, was for Uljaitu, and he was both Sunni and Shia, and before that he was Christian. So how are you going to classify that? The Miraj Nameh that I showed you was made probably for Abu Sa'id, who was a Sunni Muslim. And so the earliest figural representations where Muhammad's face is not veiled are actually from for a Sunni patron who happens to also be of Mongol extraction and living in Iran. So this is much more messy, right? And we do have figuration in Ottoman lands, but the Prophet Muhammad's face is veiled, so it's not complete figuration. There's still an element of camouflage. But today, because we're so intent on creating these standalone categories, right? Sorting things out, to borrow the name of some scholars. We tend to think of Iran equals Shia, Arab lands equals Sunni, images of Muhammad equals that, no images is that, and now we've got a nice polarized view, and we can pit things easily against each other, and we have easy answers, but the answers are never easy. And I think this is that kind of restricted public discourse that we have to really acknowledge because it exists, but we also kind of have to fight against a little bit to make it a little more messy because the historical data shows that it might be an intellectual fallacy to create those dichotomies of thought and interpretation.
And this is more of a personal question. In studying these images, what surprised you the most as an art historian?
That I'm never done discovering, right when I think I've seen the corpus and have a good handle on it, I find something totally different and new, and it boggles my mind, and I need to understand it. And it increases the richness. And so the latest discovery for me, I wrote that book 10 years ago. It came out, 6 years ago. So when people ask me, would you like to talk about the Prophet Muhammad or write? I'm like, oh, I've said everything. It's done. Like I'm gonna just repeat myself. I'm a broken record. But then you discover something else. You're like, oh, I thought it was done, but I'm not. So I was looking at a manuscript in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, and I saw a description of this, all the thumbnails, when you load the manuscript that says in German, Prophet Muhammad appears to King Khusra in a dream. And I look at the thumbnail, I'm like, I don't see a depiction of the prophet. And so I open it up, and there's this big kind of seal-like calligram that says, Rasulullah in calligraphy. I'm like, oh, that's really strange, like a calligram. But this manuscript is from 1450, and in the 15th century, artists were representing the Prophet Muhammad fully. And then I looked really closely at the painting, and I realized that somebody later on had actually included that calligraphy and had actually destroyed the image of Muhammad lying underneath in the original painting, which launched a really interesting conversation with the curator of Islamic manuscripts in Berlin. And I said, oh, I detect the outline of Burak. I see Muhammad's flaming halo behind this seal that has an inscription. I see the outline of his turban. He goes, oh, I had never looked at that closely, but yeah, I see that. I'm like, well, that could have been done in the 17th century, 18th century, before the manuscript got into the library in 1857 or whatever year it was. And then, I have a conversation with a curator that leads to a conversation with the conservator that leads to, oh my goodness, we need to do light penetrative photography. And then that adds a whole other dimension, right? We talked about rubbing images or adding veils to Muhammad's face, but in this case, somebody came along, didn't want an image of the Prophet Muhammad, most likely a Muslim owner or artist. And the strategy there was not adding a veil or removing the figure, but adding a calligraphy on top. And so, what really surprises me over and over again is that I'm never done discovering things and I'm never done actually solving the puzzle. And that's why all of us sort of academics are in it. You're never done with the challenge. And you find something else, you're like, I have to figure this one out because this is interesting.
And do you think there's been a revival or renewed academic interest in figural depictions of Muhammad today? If so, how so?
Yeah, I think so. I think many individuals, such as yourselves, are now interested in finding out about this aspect of Islamic cultural production. It's not a big field. There aren't that many of us out there who work on this topic. And okay, we can't stop the scandals from erupting. They have erupted, they will erupt, but maybe that's also an opportunity for education. And then the next time you educate, a public or a student, you might actually push exactly the right button for that person's passion, and then they might want to pursue some sort of subject that's related to it. And so I've seen now some scholars who are at the phase of writing their dissertation on images of the prophet, of the prophets in the plural. And it's really lovely to see that because that's, carrying the baton forward. And that's thrilling because that just means a new generation, new thoughts, new interventions, and sort of pushing things forward eventually.
And how do you hope future research within Islamic art history will build on your work on prophetic imagery?
I think there's still just a lot of work to be done. I mentioned before that I had to jettison a whole chapter because it didn't gel, and that was a chapter on mobile images of the Prophet Muhammad. I do think there are plenty of images out there. I just couldn't find a way to make them hang together. And so it would be great if somebody in the future actually looked at images of the Prophet Muhammad in South Asia, which is not in the book. It would be wonderful if more colleagues paid attention to 19th century Iranian lithographed books. My colleague Ali Bozari has worked quite a bit on images in 19th century printed books in Iran, and there are lots of images of the Prophet Muhammad there. And that would open up the question of the printing press, right? And what happens to the iconography of the Prophet once it enters a public domain. It would be also interesting, and I have a colleague working on this topic, to look at late Ottoman depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, both in manuscripts and the printing press. One of my colleagues in Switzerland, his name is Tobias Heinzelmann, has worked on this long poem called the Muhammadiyah. So it's a poem about Muhammad by the Ottoman writer Yazıcıoğlu is the name. And there are lots of images that accompany that praise poem to the Prophet. And there, all the figural images are just round circles. So, Prophet Muhammad is just a circle, sometimes with gold or his name inside it. So that would be interesting to pursue there too. And it's not just in Islamic art history where I think there's an intervention to be made and there's just more to be studied. I think, if we are to sort of broaden it, it would be really interesting to see the Islamic humanities, and that's a growing field. Islamic studies, like what you've done, to bring art history and visual evidence to the fore. And I'm seeing that happen quite a bit. Many historians of Islam or folks in Islamic studies are taking visual material evidence much more seriously now and putting them in conversation with text so that they have a panoply of different historical data to synthesize and get a more rounded picture. So I think there's more to be done in terms of images of Muhammad, not just in art history, but in Islamic humanities, Islamic studies, and then art history writ large. My colleagues in art history who work on European, images or American painting or Japanese devotional art, I think they will have really interesting conversations with us too to figure out how devotion or a notion of the sacred can be conveyed through creative expression. So there's a lot to be done, and it really depends on what the person wants to get out of the corpus for their own purposes.
It all sounds really interesting. And Professor Gruber, this has actually been a very rich and eye-opening conversation. But before we wrap up, I'd love to end by looking a bit beyond the scope of the book we've discussed today. Not only have you contributed incredible scholarship through your many publications on Islamic art, but you've also been at the forefront of making Islamic art history more accessible to the wider public, especially through your work with CAMSIN, the Islamic Art History Online website. Could you tell us a bit about what inspired the creation of that platform, what you see as its core mission, and how it's helping to reshape how people, both inside and outside the academy, engage with Islamic visual culture?
Yeah, thanks. So Hamsin is this free and open platform of scholarly resources, small talks, worksheets, and more for Islamic art history and visual culture. And the way it was born was 5 years ago when COVID broke out. I realized we had to find a way to bridge the gap, and I really wanted my colleagues' voices beaming inside my classroom. And I asked my colleagues, how can we help each other? Maybe doing little videos with our expertise, we could have them virtually in our classrooms because our classrooms were virtual. And so we started creating these very short talks, which were thematic. And then we realized we could also do term talks, which were really short, like 5 minutes, explain the term masjid or mosque, or explain the term kalem or, read pen. And those could come in super handy in the classroom. You can mix and match it with your lecture, other exercises. And then we saw our Google statistics and we realized, it's not just students and scholars accessing our material, which are scholarly but completely accessible in terms of, the delivery. So there's no jargon at all. And by now we've had about 350,000 views in the last 5 years. And so there's a real demand, there's a thirst for knowledge about Islam and Islamic art by people just using the internet, what I consider just continuous learners. We're all learners on the internet. And it's very important for people to have reliable information about Islam and Islamic art. And so I've been building this website with my team members and with all of my colleagues from different fields so that experts out there can lend their voice and explain certain things in an accessible way. And so that individuals can put a face and a voice to the expert and then learn from them without paying anything, using them however they want. So for me, that's the gold standard. That's why many of us became scholars or teachers. We just want to be able to chat with people and maybe make a small difference in the world. And the way to do that is to burst through every possible wall you can think of.
Which is why today is like such a wonderful time to be alive, just because you're able to get all of this stuff out there with the internet, with social media, with mass communication across the globe being the way that it is. It really makes things in a good way feel a bit, it makes the world feel a bit smaller. Um, so I mean, we're at the end of our podcast. This has been phenomenal. I really thank you for your time. You've shed so much light on artwork that I find to be really phenomenal, but never really had that expert insight on it. And so, if there's anything that you would like to leave us with, the stage is yours. But we thank you for coming on to our podcast. You've added an invaluable contribution to what we do. So.
The only thing I can add is a huge thanks to you both. Your questions were marvelous. You're incredible interlocutors and conversationalists. And thank you for the work that you're doing, putting out all of these expert voices and conversations for folks to access again on YouTube without having to have to go into an ivory tower. So the work that you're doing is really important, and I appreciate it a lot. So thank you.
You're welcome and thank you. And I hope that we speak again.
Absolutely. We're never very far.